The signal hit Daya's headphones at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the first thing she said was, "Finn, that's not static." Finn Akafer looked up from the thermos he was unscrewing. He and Daya Reyes had shared every Tuesday night shift at the Morrow Creek Amateur Radio Society for 8 months, 2 college students, 1 borrowed frequency license, and a converted fire lookout tower on the ridge above town that the county had sold for $1 in 2019. The tower had no heat. It had a folding card table, 3 surplus receivers, and a view of the whole valley, which was what they'd wanted when they started trying to map local lightning interference patterns for Daya's atmospheric science thesis. They had stopped mapping lightning interference 6 months ago. Now they just came because the tower was quiet, and the sky was clear, and the coffee was good. Finn set down the thermos, put it on the speaker. Daya routed the signal to the small Bluetooth speaker wedged between 2 equipment cases. What came out was not static. It was also not a voice or a Morse pattern or any tone sequence either of them recognized. It was structured unmistakably, insistently structured, in the way that a sentence is structured even when you can't read the language, rhythmic without being musical, repeating without being mechanical. It had gaps that felt like punctuation. "Frequency?" Finn asked. 1,420 megahertz. Daya's voice had gone very flat and careful in the way it did when she was trying not to get ahead of the data. Plus a modulation shift of approximately 1.7 hertz, cycling. I've never seen that combination on anything in the interference log. Finn knew the frequency. Everyone who had ever taken an intro to radio astronomy course knew the frequency. 1,420 megahertz was the hydrogen line, the natural emission frequency of the most common element in the universe, and the frequency that radio astronomers and theoretical alien contact researchers had agreed, since the 1950s, that a transmitting civilization might use as a universal landmark. It was also, for that reason, protected by international agreement. No licensed terrestrial broadcaster used it. Nothing they had encountered in 8 months of logging the local sky had touched it. "Daya, I know. I know what it is." She pulled off her headphones and set them on the table and looked at the receiver as if it were an animal that might move. "Log it. I need you to log it with a timestamp while I pull the antenna orientation." Finn opened the log laptop and started typing. His hands were not entirely steady. He logged the timestamp, the frequency, the modulation note, the antenna bearing, and then he stopped because he wasn't sure what to put in the source field. He typed unknown and left it. Daya had the antenna control interface up and was sweeping the bearing in small increments, watching the signal strength meter. The strength peaked at 23 degrees east of zenith. She locked the bearing and ran the elevation. The signal was coming from high. Not from a tower, not from a satellite in the common orbital bands. She had the ephemeris data on a second tablet, and she cycled through every active satellite in the current sky window. Nothing matched. The bearing and the elevation pointed to a patch of sky between the constellation Lyra and the edge of the Milky Way band, and that patch of sky contained no human-made object that any database she could access in the next 4 minutes would confirm. She looked at Finn. Finn looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. They had talked about this before, not seriously, not in the way scientists talk about a real contingency, but in the abstract theoretical way that people who spend their nights pointing receivers at the sky sometimes do, usually around 2 in the morning when the coffee is gone and the conversation gets loose. What would you do? What would the actual first move be? Daya had always said, log everything, triangulate if possible, look for structure. Finn had said, don't touch the transmit controls. Neither of them had considered what it would feel like to be in the moment when the hypothetical stopped being hypothetical. And what it felt like was that all the blood in Daya's body had relocated to somewhere behind her sternum and was pounding there steadily, while the rest of her moved through the steps with a kind of eerie calm. She plugged the recording interface in. She set it to continuous capture. She checked that the drive had space. It had 11 hours of space, and she hit record and watched the waveform begin drawing itself across the screen in real time. The signal lasted 4 minutes and 31 seconds. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Dea had ever heard. "Did we lose it?" Finn asked. "The receiver is active. The antenna is locked. There's nothing on the frequency." She checked the bearing. The sky above 23 degrees east of zenith was still there. Whatever had been transmitting from it was not transmitting anymore. Finn poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down and stared at the waveform on the screen. It had a shape. You could see it even visually, not just in the repeating rhythm, but in the internal variation. Different sections, different densities, a pattern that built and then resolved and then built again. He was not a linguist and he was not a signal theorist, but he had taken enough physics to recognize that randomness did not do that. Randomness did not resolve. "It's going to start again," Dea said. She didn't know why she was sure of this. She was sure. She was right. At 12:19 a.m., exactly 31 minutes and 8 seconds after the first transmission ended, the signal returned. Same frequency, same modulation, different content. She could hear the difference even without analysis. The rhythm had changed, the internal structure had shifted. If the first transmission was a sentence, this felt like a paragraph. More information, longer gaps, a slower internal cadence, as if whatever was transmitting had adjusted something. Finn had his phone out. He had opened the search interface to every amateur radio astronomy forum, every active signal logging collective, every public anomaly database he knew. He was looking for other reports on the same frequency in the same window. He found 3, one from a backyard observer in northern Finland, one from a university array in New Mexico, one from a single operator in Queensland, Australia, who had posted 40 minutes ago with a screenshot of a waveform that looked, at a quick glance, very much like what was on Dea's screen. "It's not just us," he said. Dea read the posts over his shoulder. Her throat was doing something complicated. "Global. It's transmitting in all directions simultaneously, or it's transmitting in sequence, and the sequence is very fast. Or there's more than one source." She hadn't thought of that. She sat with it. More than one source, coordinated. A network. Log the external reports with timestamps. I want to know if the modulation shift matches across sites. He started logging. She went back to the waveform and pulled up the analysis tools, the frequency spectrum display, the autocorrelation function, the mathematical pattern detection scripts she had written for the lightning interference project, never imagining she would use them for this. She ran the autocorrelation on the first transmission, and it returned a hit almost immediately. A repeating unit of approximately 4.3 seconds, embedded in a longer cycle of approximately 31 seconds. Inside the 4.3-second unit, a further subdivision of 0.7 seconds. The numbers were clean. They were not approximate or fuzzy the way natural emissions were fuzzy. They were the kind of clean that only happens when someone decides to make something clean. She stared at the number 0.7 for a while. Then she opened the constants table on her tablet. The ratio of 4.3 to 0.7 was approximately 6.14. She checked pi. She checked E. She tried a few others. Then she tried the ratio of the hydrogen line frequency to the hydroxyl line frequency, the so-called water hole that radio astronomers used as a second landmark, and the result was 6.15, which was close enough that her hands had to stop moving for a moment. "Finn," she said, "come look at this." He came and looked. She walked him through the calculation twice. The second time he sat down. "They're using the water hole ratio as a key inside the signal," he said, "to signal that it's a signal. So anyone analyzing it will recognize the reference and know it's intentional. That's my reading." "Dea," he picked up his coffee cup and then put it down again. "That's a deliberate contact attempt. That's not, you don't accidentally encode the water-hole ratio in a 1420 MHz transmission. No, you don't. They sat with that for a while. Outside the lookout tower, the valley was dark and quiet. The town of Morrow Creek had about 4,000 people in it, and most of them were asleep. The ridge was cold. The sky above was enormous and very clear, and somewhere in the direction of Lyra, or somewhere much further than Lyra, using Lyra only as a direction, something had been paying attention to the same physics that human scientists had been paying attention to for 70 years, and had chosen to use that shared physics as a handshake. The second transmission ended at 12:43 a.m. Dea sat very still for approximately 90 seconds. Then she said quietly, "I think we should respond." Finn looked at her. "We don't have authorization to transmit on that frequency." "I know. We'd be violating the license." "I know that too." He was quiet. "Then, what would we transmit?" Dea had been thinking about it since the first transmission ended. She pulled up a blank signal editor on the laptop. The question was not what language to use. They had no common language, and any attempt at language would be noise. The question was what the signal itself, the shape of it, could say. The transmission they had received had embedded a mathematical reference, a known constant used as proof of intent. The only answer to that, the only response that would be legible to whatever had sent it, was another mathematical reference, proof of receipt. Proof that someone had understood the key. She built the signal in 12 minutes. It was not long. It was the water-hole ratio, encoded in a pulse sequence at 1420 MHz, modulated with a 1.7 Hz shift that mirrored the shift in the incoming signal. Their version echoed back. Then, after a gap of exactly 31 seconds, the longer cycle they had identified, a second element. A pulse sequence encoding the value of pi to 6 decimal places, the oldest and most universal proof of intelligence in the human repertoire. Finn watched her build it without saying anything. When she finished, he read through it carefully. Then he said, "If this causes an interstellar incident, I want it on record that you were the one at the keyboard." "Logged," Dea said, and transmitted. The signal went out at 12:58 a.m. 4 seconds of mirrored modulation, 31 seconds of silence, and then pi, offered up into the sky from a fire lookout tower on a ridge above a small valley in northern New Mexico, transmitted by two people who had not slept and whose coffee had gone cold. They waited. At 1:44 a.m., the sky answered. The third transmission was different in character from the first two, shorter, more concentrated, structured around a single repeating unit that Dea recognized within 30 seconds as a transformation of the water-hole ratio they had sent back. Their own signal, taken and rebuilt into something new, with additional mathematical content added to it that she could not yet read. It was not an echo. It was a reply. It had processed what they sent and returned it changed, the way a conversation changes what it receives. Finn had stopped breathing for a moment. She could tell because she heard him start again. Neither of them spoke for the 4 minutes and 12 seconds the third transmission lasted. They sat in the cold lookout tower above the sleeping valley and listened, and the feeling that moved through Dea in that time was not fear, and it was not exactly excitement. It was something larger and stranger than either, a kind of vertiginous awe at the scale of what was ordinary. The physics were the same everywhere. The ratios held. Whatever was transmitting from the direction of Lyra had found the same constants that human scientists had found, and had decided that those constants were a good place to start. That shared recognition, that the universe had given both of them the same numbers to work with, felt, in that cold, dark tower, like the most staggering fact Dea had ever sat inside. When the transmission ended, she replayed the recording twice. Then she saved it, backed it up to 2 separate drives, and opened a message to her thesis advisor that she was going to have a very hard time writing. "We should call someone," Finn said. "SETI, the FCC, someone." Yes. Dea did not move immediately. She was looking at the waveform on the screen, all three transmissions now laid out in sequence, the shape of something that was not yet a language but was already, unmistakably, a conversation. She was thinking about the water hole, about how human scientists had decided, decades before she was born, that any civilization capable of building a radio transmitter would also have discovered hydrogen and hydroxyl, and that the frequency between them was the natural meeting point, the place in the spectrum where you went to look and to be seen. They had been right. It worked. 70 years of pointing receivers at an empty sky, and it worked. And it had worked on a Tuesday night in a tower with no heat, found by two graduate students who had come up here originally to study lightning. She thought about what that meant, not for the signal, but for the assumption underneath it. That the same universe that built hydrogen also built minds capable of discovering hydrogen, and that those minds, wherever they arose and whatever else they differed on, would have this in common. They would look up. They would listen. And when they found the right frequency, they would use it. Dea Finn said, "We should call someone." "I know," she said again. She picked up her phone. Her hand was steady. She was 19 years old, and she had just learned in a very specific and irrefutable way that the universe was full of company. "I know we should. Give me a minute." She was looking at the sky through the tower's east-facing window, the cold, clear, enormous sky, with its stars and its hidden distances, and whatever was out there at 23 degrees east of zenith, working with the same numbers she worked with, listening at the same frequencies, waiting in its own way to be understood. She gave herself one more minute. Then she started making calls.